Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome from wherever you are joining us. My name is Julie Rajan, and I'm on the faculty of the Department of Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies at Rutgers University in New Brunswick. I am so pleased to welcome you to this panel entitled Gender Apartheid, which continues the focus of the Global 16 Days campaign on femicide. Before we get into the panel, just a bit about the campaign. You may know that the Global 16 Days campaign was initiated in 1991 by the Center for Women's Global Leadership at Rutgers University to foster what would become the largest international feminist movement led by civil society. Today, we are honored to have Charlotte Bunch, one of the founders of the campaign, tell you more about it. First, a quick introduction to Charlotte, although truly she doesn't need one. Charlotte Bunch, she, her pronouns, is Distinguished Professor Emerita in Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies at Rutgers, and founder and executive director of the Center for Women's Global Leadership. She has been an activist in feminist, LGBTQ+, and other human rights movements for over 50 years. She was a leader of the global campaign for the recognition of women's rights as human rights, as well as other international feminist initiatives. Charlotte will now briefly discuss the feminist activist origins of the 16 Days campaign. Over to you, Charlotte.
What I really wanted to emphasize in talking about the feminist origins is that the 16 Days campaign came from feminists. It came from civil society activists, and we worked to build the campaign by giving the participants in the campaign around the globe, as well as different organizations, their own space to define how they would observe the campaign within the larger framework of women's rights as human rights and an understanding of the first demand of the campaign, which was to see all forms of violence against women as human rights abuse. And two things I want to say about that. One is it was crucial that it was a diverse group. I've forgotten now, I think it was from 25 different countries throughout the world. And it was a group of activists who believed that a small group can make something important happen. And we tried to build on things that women had done before us. So obviously, the 16 Days begins on November 25th. Many of you may know that that is now International Day Against Violence Against Women. What you may not know is that that started at a Latin American encuentro in Bogota, Colombia in 1981. So the Day of Against Violence Against Women, which we now have internationally and marked by the UN, began from the Latin American feminist movement, which was one of the movements that brought the most emphasis to the question of violence against women. So rather than come up with something new, we wanted to start on a day that we knew the movement had begun, but that the world hadn't recognized yet. And that is now a part of the calendar of important days. Of course, it ends on Human Rights Day, December 10th, which was obviously our choice for linking violence to human rights. But it also included World AIDS Day, which especially in 1991, when the AIDS epidemic was still so widespread in so many parts of the world, and women had not been seen as much as men as victims of the AIDS crisis. It was also a way to bring the link between violence against women and HIV/AIDS. So I think that really what I love about the 16 Days campaign is that it's an example of how you can begin with a determined group of feminists from diverse places and build toward a campaign that is now worldwide, that is taken up by groups and have many different themes and flavors, but that is not owned by anyone. For 30 years, the Center for Women's Global Leadership put out a calendar and maintained communications for feminists in this campaign, but many other people have their own calendars and their own initiation. And as long as they stood by the principles of feminism and women's rights as human rights, we didn't try to control any other campaign. And I think that's at the heart of the success of the 16 days of activism. And the other heart of the success is that it has been a part of worldwide recognition that violence against women is still one of the most prevalent patriarchal forms of oppression left in the world, violence as a means of controlling women. And there is no country, there is no group that has completely eliminated it. But we have many things that we've learned about how to address violence against women. And I really look forward to this panel discussing that from many different perspectives. And I'm really grateful that the 16 days of activism still provides this kind of global space for looking at both the universality of violence against women and the diversity of how it takes different forms in different countries, regions, cultures, situations, and that allows us to keep in a vital creative tension both diversity and universality. So I'm really eager to hear what each of the panelists have to say. And thank you, Julie, for putting this program together.
Okay, so I will now introduce Nishi, who will provide some information about, that's okay, no problem.
Yeah.
Who will provide some information about the 16 Days campaign and its focus on femicide. Nishi Shah, she, her pronouns, is the program coordinator for the Gloria Steinem Endowed Chair in Media, Culture, and Feminist Studies, and the Allison Bernstein Media Mentoring Program at the Institute for Women's Leadership at Rutgers University. She has transitioned into this role from running the Global 16 Days campaign under the Rutgers Center for Women's Global Leadership. Nishi has worked with the Syrian Emergency Task Force to bring support and awareness to women and orphans who were displaced by the Syrian Revolution, as well as with Yala Young Leaders to develop youth throughout the Middle East, to help youth throughout the Middle East participate in citizen journalism via social media. Nishi will address the Global 16 campaign's focus on femicide briefly.
Thank you, Julie, and hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are joining from. As Julie mentioned, my name is Nishi Shah, and I am the program coordinator at the Rutgers Institute for Women's Leadership, where I run multiple programs and events focused on media and feminism. Prior to this role, I was the last coordinator of the Global 16 Days campaign at the Center for Women's Global Leadership, or CWGL, alongside our moderator today, Melissa. Before the center was sunset in 2022, the most recent global campaign conducted by CWGL focused on ending femicide by not only amplifying awareness of what this issue is and how widespread and critical it is, but also by demanding that governments worldwide act urgently to hold perpetrators of all forms of femicide accountable, all while uniting movements and struggles across borders to build solidarity. Today's panel on gender apartheid is a continuation of that multi-year campaign and a way for the Rutgers community to reaffirm its support of this important topic. But before we begin, I would like to introduce my colleague, Akanksha Bhatter. We'll talk about the Global 16 Days Archive at the Rutgers Libraries. Akanksha is a researcher and community-centered organizer with over 5 years of experience advancing gender equity, reproductive justice, and LGBTQ+ rights in India and the United States. She recently completed her master's in women's gender and sexuality studies at Rutgers, where she specialized in feminist practices for social change and wrote her thesis on the ethical and colonial dilemmas of representing childhood in humanitarian aid. During her time at Rutgers, she also worked closely on the 16 Days of Activism campaign. Over to you, Akanksha.
Thank you so much, Nishi. And hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening. As Nishi mentioned, my name is Akanksha, and I'm a recent graduate of the master's program in Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies here at Rutgers. While I was at Rutgers, I had the opportunity to work under the leadership of Kayo Denda, head of the Marjorie Somers Foster Center and also the librarian for Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies. Together with her and our archivists, we worked to preserve CWGL's history and legacy, with a special focus on the 16 Days campaign. As part of this effort to reclaim and honor the campaign's roots, more than 70 boxes of CWGL material were transferred to special collections and university archives for organization and preservation. We also began developing a comprehensive research guide dedicated to the 16 Days campaign. I encourage you all to check out the library's page to learn more about it. And for any questions or additional information, please feel free to reach out to Kayo Denda. Her email is in the chat. As one of the two international graduate students drawn to Rutgers by CWGL's legacy, my colleague and I also launched a student-led movement on campus. Over 2 years there, we spoke in classes, tabled at events, and used social media to spark conversations about the 16 Days campaign on campus and gender-based violence at Rutgers. And now we turn to today's panel event. The moderator for today's panel is Melissa Upreti, pronouns she, her, former chair of the UN Working Group on Discrimination Against Women and Girls Human Rights Council. Melissa is an internationally recognized human rights lawyer who has spent over 2 decades advancing women's rights and gender equality. She has held leadership positions at the International Commission of Jurists, the Center for Women's Global Leadership, and the Center for Reproductive Rights. She was appointed by the UN Human Rights Council to serve as the expert member of the UN Working Group on Discrimination Against Women and Girls from 2017 to 2023. While at the Center for Women's Global Leadership, she led the design of and directed 2 successive multi-year Global 16 Days campaigns in support of the adoption and ratification of ILO Convention 190 on violence and harassment in the world of work from 2017 to 2019 and to end femicide from 2020 to 2022. Over to you, Melissa.
Thank you very much, Akanksha. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. I am absolutely delighted to once again join the Rutgers University community, including some of my former colleagues and the esteemed panelists for today's webinar in the run-up to this year's annual 16 Days of Activism. Thank you, Professor Julie Rajan, for the invitation, and members of her team, Nishi and Akanksha, for their support in the preparations and also for the technical support that you are providing today to make this webinar possible. I'm going to play a dual role. I will first present a few thoughts about gender apartheid and some of the progress that has been made in seeking the legal recognition of a definition of gender apartheid under international law, and then I will serve as moderator. Many actors are involved in this process of advocacy for the recognition of gender apartheid as a violation of international human rights. And I will, from my own personal experience, focus on some of the contributions to this movement of the UN Working Group on Discrimination Against Women and Girls, which is a mechanism that operates within the Human Rights Council in its role as a women's human rights mechanism, actually only one of 2 established by the Council, which has helped pave the way for where we are today. So let me start by noting that the term gender apartheid has been used by Afghan women to describe the institutionalized gender-based oppression and domination perpetrated by the Taliban regime in Afghanistan from 1996 to 2001, and since it assumed power again in 2021. This framing, this term, has gained currency among Afghan women's rights activists over the years, And with the solidarity of global feminists and other supporters and allies, the demand for its recognition has become a powerful call to action. Now, it is a travesty that gender apartheid remains unrecognized as a standalone crime under international law, similar to how the system of apartheid based on race was recognized as a crime in relation to South Africa, which eventually contributed to its official end in 1994, although many of its legacies remain. Fortunately, international law is not static, and historically, feminists have played a crucial role in bringing about major advancements in international law on gender equality. What's interesting is that some of the women's human rights mechanisms and bodies created with the support of feminist movements have strongly championed such developments. Rather than limiting themselves to merely applying international norms and standards as they exist, they've often facilitated the much-needed expansion of these norms and standards and called for new ones where there are gaps. They've done this by taking into consideration women's lived experiences, as opposed to only the positions of governments, and by applying an intersectional analysis to address the marginalization and exclusion of different groups. In doing so, they've played an active role in centering the demand for the recognition of gender apartheid within the broader public, international, legal, and political discourse today, despite the persistence of a global trend of rollbacks of women's rights and attacks on the very concepts of gender and gender equality. These mechanisms have worked closely with civil society to hold their ground against the rollbacks and to break new ground in various areas of international law, including international criminal law. Now, the Taliban takeover in August 2021 has no doubt given an impetus to the demand for the legal recognition of gender apartheid and made it urgent to do so. The need for legal recognition was one of the main conclusions from a joint mission conducted by the UN Working Group on Discrimination Against Women and Girls, on which I had the honor to serve between 2017 to 2023, and the Special Rapporteur in Afghanistan, who was appointed in 2023. The joint mission was mandated by the Human Rights Council in 2002 through a resolution that was adopted that year, following the rapid deterioration of the situation of women and girls in Afghanistan, where the Taliban did not waste any time in dismantling the constitutional framework and institutions which had been built during 20 years of non-Taliban rule and replacing them with repressive decrees and institutional structures based on their own political vision. The joint mission took place from the 27th of April to the 4th of May in 2023 and confirmed the existence of an environment of extreme deprivation and control through the relentless issuance of edicts and a climate of uncertainty, impunity, and fear. Mandatory requirements of mahram, or a male guardian as a companion in public, a dress code, and proper, quote-unquote, proper hijab. Women were being arbitrarily arrested, detained, interrogated, and subjected to torture for violating the Taliban's edicts. Girls were banned from secondary and higher education, albeit unevenly across different parts of the country. Women faced employment bans, and many of those who once ran their own businesses encountered new obstacles leading to increased economic vulnerability. The experts witnessed an immense degree of physical and psychological suffering and widespread declining mental health among women and girls. They were concerned about the increased risk of preventable deaths among women and girls, especially during pregnancy and childbirth due to the denial of access to reproductive health care. They heard from women and girls about the absence of legal recourse and remedy for violations of their rights. Now, notwithstanding the highly punitive and dangerous environment for women and girls, the experts were deeply struck by the resilience and strength of Afghan women and their consistent calls for solidarity, freedom, and justice. In our joint report presented to the Human Rights Council in 2023, we concluded that women and girls in Afghanistan were experiencing severe discrimination that may amount to gender persecution, a crime against humanity, and may be characterized as gender apartheid, as the de facto authorities appear to be governing by systemic discrimination with the intention to subject women and girls to total domination. It was our position that the gender apartheid framing emphasizes that the exclusion of and discrimination against women and girls is institutionalized and, as such, is a grave and systematic human rights violation that breaches the Charter of the United Nations, the core principles of equality and non-discrimination, and the fundamental spirit and norms of international human rights law. It was also our position that the apartheid framing highlights that other states and actors and the international community at large have a duty to take effective action to end the practice, as was done to end racial apartheid in South Africa. Our message to governments and officials across the UN system was clear. The extreme gender-based discrimination against women and girls, perpetrated with total impunity in Afghanistan, was unparalleled globally. Some of our key recommendations to member states included to mandate a report on gender apartheid with a view to developing further normative standards and tools and galvanizing international legal condemnation and action to end it and to ensure its non-repetition. Such a report was published in 2024, and a link has been dropped in the chat box in case you'd like to look at it. Another recommendation to member states was to take measures to ensure that gender persecution against women and girls in Afghanistan is fully investigated so that perpetrators and complicit actors can be held accountable. In 2024, warrants were issued by the International Criminal Court for the arrest of 2 senior Taliban leaders on charges of the crime against humanity of gender persecution under the Rome Statute. And we will probably hear more about that from one of our panelists, Professor Lisa Davis, later on. The other recommendation was to support international and Afghan civil society justice-seeking efforts for violations of women's and girls' human rights, including through the International Criminal Court, the International Court of Justice, universal jurisdiction, and all applicable human rights mechanisms. In 2024, a case was filed with the International Court of Justice under CEDAW, the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, marking the first time that a country has been taken to court by another for violations of CEDAW. In March 2023, the End Gender Apartheid campaign was launched, urging the international community to recognize gender apartheid under international and domestic law, and you will hear more about this from another one of our panelists later. So as I proceed to wrap up my remarks, I would like to say a few words about the incredibly dire situation in Iran, which has not received as much attention despite many calls for solidarity and action. Women in Iran are experiencing what has been described as gender apartheid, and one way in which it is being sustained and enforced is through the unrestrained use of the death penalty. Iran accounts for the highest number of women executed by any country. In 2024, anywhere between 31 to 34 women were executed, and this is the official number. The number could be much higher. This year, the regime has already executed 53 women. In Iran, women are being sentenced to death without due process and executed for committing murder in situations where they themselves have been routinely subjected to domestic violence. Many are on death row for their political activism or on drug-related charges. None of these qualify as serious offenses which would justify the use of the death penalty. Every Tuesday, prisoners go on strike to protest their incarceration, and they are now in the 95th week of their campaign. The UN Independent International Fact-Finding Mission on the Islamic Republic of Iran has sounded the alarm over the surge in executions, especially since last year, signaling that they could amount to crimes against humanity. And we will hear more about the situation of women in Iran from one of our panelists. So as I conclude, I would like to say that it is clear that the failure to codify gender apartheid under international law constitutes a major accountability gap, which must be remedied. One opportunity for realizing this goal is the process that is currently underway to draft a new treaty on the prevention and punishment of crimes against humanity. In February 2024, the UN Working Group on Discrimination Against Women and Girls called for the inclusion of gender apartheid in the draft Crimes Against Humanity Treaty, asserting that only the apartheid framework can fully grasp the role of intent, ideology, and institutionalization in gender apartheid regimes as seen in Afghanistan. So, as food for thought, I would like to note that while this is a route that should be taken, we will have to wait at least another 3 to 4 years for a new treaty to be adopted. And it is unlikely to apply retroactively. Moreover, there are some discussions about how gender apartheid should be defined and concerns about the level of political support from governments for its inclusion. We believe that there needs to be more support from governments for this endeavor to be successful. So our panelists today may delve into some of these questions and more. So without further ado, what I'm going to do now is transition to the role of moderator and take us into the next part of the webinar. The format we will follow is to have each panelist speak for about 12 minutes or so, followed by a Q&A session, during which I hope members of the audience will seize the opportunity to ask some questions by dropping them in the Q&A box. So our first panelist today is Bahar Ghandehari. Bahar Ghandehari, who uses the pronouns she, her, is Director of Advocacy at the Center for Human Rights in Iran. She is an Iranian-born human rights defender and the Director of Advocacy at the Center for Human Rights in Iran. Bahar is also a Junior Policy Fellow at the Atlantic Council Strategic Litigation Project, working on the End Gender Apartheid campaign. She is the founder of the youth-led organization Middle East Matters, which focuses on media journalism and digital human rights campaigns. She previously served as the advocacy officer at the Syrian Emergency Task Force, where she worked on policy advocacy and accountability efforts concerning human rights issues and atrocities in Syria. Bahar's presentation is entitled How Gender Apartheid in Iran is Crushing Women's Lives and Futures. Bahar, over to you.
Thank you so much, Melissa. Hello, everyone. I am so happy to be with you today. I'm just going to quickly share my presentation. Perfect. My name is Bahar Ghandehari. I am with the Center for Human Rights in Iran, and today I will be talking about how gender apartheid is crushing women's lives and futures in Iran. Just a little background, the crime of apartheid, the term apartheid means apart in Afrikaans, coming from the South African apartheid regime that was imposed from 1948 to the 1990s, where the South African government established and deliberately maintained a system of governance that entrenched the systematic domination and oppression of Black and non-white people in every aspect of political, economic, and social cultural life. The international community condemned the system, leading to the legal codification of racial apartheid as an international crime in the 1973 Apartheid Convention, and later in the 1998 Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court. And the problem with this definition is that under international law, as Melissa mentioned, apartheid based on gender is not recognized as a crime because the apartheid standards were designed to address racial apartheid in South Africa, and that's why activists and legal experts are advocating for its formal recognition as a crime against humanity to expand the legal, political, and diplomatic tools needed to address such systematic gender-based rights violations. In Iran, for example, women are treated as second-class citizens. Gender-based discrimination is systematic and institutionalized, meaning discriminatory laws and policies are intended to enforce and maintain the Islamic Republic of Iran's domination and entrench the state's power. And this is the website for the End Gender Apartheid campaign on the right side that you can visit and learn more about the campaign. The gender apartheid in Iran goes back to 4 decades. It started in the early days of the Islamic Revolution. On March 8, 1979, women poured the street on International Women's Day in Tehran, protesting then Supreme Leaders Ayatollah Khomeini's decree mandating compulsory veiling for women. Their resistance was met with violence, similar to today, but they have been going on for the past 4 decades. A lot of us know Iran for its hijab discrimination. However, gender apartheid has other forms in Iran as well, but it is not really talked about. Women are restricted women's rights are restricted in marriage, divorce, inheritance, child custody, work, the legal system, the courts, political office, travel, lifestyle, and clothing. And the Iranian regime has entrenched and enforced systematic gender-based subjugation and actively dismantled protective mechanisms for women as well. So the first example is mandatory dress code that a lot of us are familiar with. At age 9, girls are legally required to adhere to mandatory dress code, although it is usually enforced at 7 when they start school. Women and girls are required to cover their hair, entire bodies, and only their face, hands, and feet visible. And punishment could be flogging, fines, and imprisonment. And I put this photo from the Women Life Freedom protest just as an example that in Iran, the fight is not against hijab, it is for the choice that women want to have to whether wear it or not to wear it. And a lot of times the regime uses the issue of hijab and says that it is a cultural thing, that states must respect our culture. And it is not true at all. And if you look at the streets of Tehran today, you may think that mandatory hijab is not a thing anymore because a lot of women are resisting by not wearing the hijab. However, the law still stands, and enforcement varies city by city, especially during times where the regime is extremely sensitive to political pressure and outside pressure. They tend to loosen up the enforcement. However, outside of Tehran, for example, outside of the capitals and outside of the urban cities, the enforcement is still happening outside of media attention. And there was a draft law that was passed in Iran's parliament, but the law was put on hold in December 2024 after domestic and international backlash. And this law really increased the punishment for hijab violations. And the UN experts called it a form of gender apartheid in 2023. And the international backlash really worked to put the law in pause. Another example of gender apartheid in Iran is male guardianship and permission to travel. Before marriage, even after turning 18, women and girls in Iran are under legal authority of their father or another male relative. And after marriage, the husband assumes many of these legal controls. Unmarried women, for example, aged 18 or older, must obtain their father's or male guardian's consent to travel abroad. And if after they're married, the husband's consent to obtain, renew, or use a passport is needed, and a husband can revoke his prior approval at any time. And we have seen examples, for example, with athletes who wanted to travel outside, and at last minute, the husband said, no, you can't. One example was a Paralympic gold medalist Zahra Nemati, who was blocked by her husband from traveling because she wanted divorce. And I say this example because the next example is inequality in marriage, divorce, and child custody in Iran. In marriage, girls can get married at age 13 or younger with the consent of a judge or a male guardian. Forced marriage, which is essentially child rape, occur in a country that's also lacking in laws, policies, and services to protect women from domestic violence. And under Iranian law, women and girls require the father's or parental grandfather's permission to marry, and a court can override his decision. This system really undermines the women's autonomy, exposing them to the risk of forced marriage and violence, and really just stripping their fundamental right to make a decision about their life and future. And inequality in divorce is really harsh in Iran. Men have an automatic right to divorce. They can unilaterally divorce their wives, even verbally. The wife doesn't need to even be present. They don't need to give consent. And the husband does not even need to prove misconduct. But women cannot start divorce proceedings without proving extreme circumstances. And the barriers and the evidentiary for these circumstances are very high. The threshold is very high. And such examples for these circumstances are addiction, imprisonment, abandonment, abuse, or refusal to provide financial support from the husband. And whether a woman, quote unquote, qualifies for divorce is entirely up to the judge, who can just reject her petition, even if there's substantial evidence of abuse or harm. And one important note is that women cannot be judges in Iran. So all of this happens in a system that is extremely male dominated. Restrictive divorce laws also trap women in abusive marriages and lead to femicides and honor killings in Iran. And a lot of these examples have happened over the year. And all of these examples that you see on the screen are just from this year. And also the inability to divorce adds to the abused woman's desperation. For example, in Iran, because they cannot get divorce easily, the last resort for a lot of women is to kill their abusive husband. And courts often ignore these circumstances and end up punishing the women with the death penalty. And one case that a lot of Iranian activists have been talking about right now is this girl who was married at age 12, and now she is facing the death penalty for killing her husband unless she can pay $90,000 to her abuser's family. Restrictive divorce laws also, oh, sorry, this is repetitive. Let me just go to the next. The next example is inequality in inheritance. Under the Islamic Republic's inheritance laws, husbands generally inherit a larger share than wives. If they don't have children, a man can inherit half of his deceased wife's assets, while a woman receives 1/4 of the deceased husband's assets. And if a couple has children, the man gets 1/4, while a woman gets 1/8. And a son inherits twice as much as a daughter. And until 2009, women couldn't even inherit land. And this is a huge problem when it comes to financial independence for a lot of women and daughters. Employment and professional barriers are also extreme in Iran for women. Women are prohibited from certain professions, such as becoming judges or holding certain government positions. And even in professions where they're permitted to work, systematic discrimination and the lack of laws prohibiting gender discrimination in the workplace limit their opportunities for advancement. Women make up, for example, 60% of university graduates in Iran, but only 14% are actually in the workplace. And the 16%, 60% a number is something that the Iranian authorities use a lot as a justification that, look, women are in the society, they can do whatever they want, but they don't really talk about the 14% number or how women are restricted in certain workplaces. For example, women can be completely forbidden by their husbands from working if the husband deems the job against family values or harmful to his reputation. And the World Economic Forum ranked Iran as one of the worst countries in the world regarding gender-based discrimination. And in addition to this, Iranian women face a lot of harassment, barriers to advancement, and other forms of discrimination when they're in the workplace, which really reinforces economic dependence on male relatives. And they're also banned from singing, dancing, and performing in public. And even if it happens online, for example, and on Instagram, their Instagram could be shut down and they can face legal actions. And they also face significant restrictions in sports participation. They're banned from, women and girls are banned from entering stadiums, and women athletes have to face strict dress codes when participating in competitions, even outside of Iran. And one example is Elnaz Rekabi, who competed in the South Korea competition in 2022 without the mandatory headscarf. And after returning to Iran, she was placed under house arrest. Criminal law in the Islamic Republic of Iran is also extremely discriminatory towards women. An example is a woman's testimony is given significantly less weight than a man's, in some instances even counted as half. And adultery laws in Iran affect women, penalize women disproportionately. Men can have temporary marriages to avoid the adultery charges in ways that women cannot, and women can be punished by flogging or even the death penalty. And the age of criminal responsibility for girls is 9, while it is 15 for boys. And a husband who kills his wife or her partner after witnessing adultery can be exempt from murder charges, yet women have no reciprocal right. And male witnesses are valued more. For example, for a conviction of rape, the victim must have 4 men witnesses to have actually witnessed the rape happening. Or if they don't have 4 men witnesses, they can have 3 men and 2 women, 2 men and 4 male witnesses are valued more. that we you can visit.
Bahar, I'm sorry, you're breaking up a little bit.
Oh, can you hear me now?
Now you're back. That's great.
Okay. Was did everyone hear me up until this point? Or
Yes,
should I?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So this presentation is mostly based on the reports that we do at the Center for Human Rights. I really encourage you guys to go read some of our reports and a lot of the press releases that we put out, and also the campaign for gender apartheid, which the website provides a lot of information regarding our legal brief. You can read about the definition of gender apartheid, how we're pursuing it, the member states' comments, and a lot of resources that you can find on the website. The Gender Apartheid campaign and Gender Apartheid campaigns has over 100 jurists, scholars, public figures, and civil society leaders who have endorsed the campaign. And we need you guys to help advocating to governments, explaining the urgent need for a gender apartheid recognition and potential ways to codify it. And there are several ways to engage in legal and policy advocacy, and you can visit that on the EGA website. And you can always get in touch with us on the email on the screen. And that should be it. Thank you so much. And that's my email if anyone wants to get in touch.
Thank you so much, Bahar. It is now my pleasure to introduce the next panelist, Professor Lisa Davis, who uses the pronouns they, them, Senior Associate Dean of Clinical Programs, Professor of Law, and Co-Director of the Human Rights and Gender Justice Clinic at CUNY School of Law, who has worked extensively on women's and LGBTQI+ rights. Their legal and advocacy work has been cited by the UN Security Council, UN General Assembly, the Supreme Court of India, Colombia's Special Jurisdiction for Peace, the International Law Commission, Human Rights Watch, and others. They currently serve as Special Advisor on gender and other discriminatory crimes to the International Criminal Court. In that capacity, they drafted the ICC Office of the Prosecutor's first ever policy on the crime of gender persecution. They helped shape the landmark gender persecution charges in the Afghanistan arrest warrants, the first in history to recognize LGBTQI+ victims of persecution as a crime against humanity. Lisa's presentation is entitled Race, Gender, and Apartheid in the Draft Crimes Against Humanity Treaty. Over to you, Lisa.
Thanks so much, Melissa. It's great to be here. I'm just going to share my screen. Can everybody see my presentation?
Yes.
Great. All right. So what I want to talk to you today about is how to understand the crime of apartheid in terms of how we apply it under international criminal law. So you heard some great examples about conditions that amount to what we describe as gender apartheid in both Afghanistan and in Iran. You're also going to hear about conditions that amount to gender apartheid in Bangladesh. So it's really important that we get this crime codified and recognized under international criminal law in the Crimes Against Humanity Treaty, and that we also are working to make sure that it's inclusive of all of its victims. Now, to do that, we have to look at the definition and understand it. And since the definition that's been proposed under the Crimes Against Humanity Draft Treaty is so similar to the same one that's under the Rome Statute, I thought that's where we could start. So let's look at the definition under the Rome Statute. What does it say? Well, it defines the crime of apartheid as inhumane acts of a character similar to those referred to in paragraph 1, committed in the context of an institutionalized regime of systematic oppression and domination by one racial group over another racial group or groups, and committed with the intention to maintaining that regime. So what does that mean? Well, it means, first of all, that lawyers love writing really long sentences. So I think we have to break this down a little bit. Now, if we break this down, we see that there's actually 4 components to this crime. And if we take those components and we list them out, it's even easier to understand. So let's look at the first component, inhumane acts of a character similar to those referred to in paragraph 1. Well, what's paragraph 1? Well, paragraph 1 is where we find the list of acts that amount to crimes against humanity. So things like murder, rape, and torture. So those acts would certainly amount to acts, inhumane acts that make up the crime of apartheid. But what if we want to charge other inhumane acts? What about denying women the right to education, like what's happening in Afghanistan? Denying women and girls education, denying women the right to freedom of assembly, freedom of movement, denying LGBTQI plus persons the right to even just exist. How do we charge those human rights violations as crimes? Because they're not listed here. Well, the way we would do it is we charge gender persecution because those acts amount to gender persecution. So if you can prove gender persecution, then you can use those acts, those human rights violations, as a foundation for proving gender apartheid. So let's go to the second and the fourth. I like to take these together. I think they fit well together. It's looking at the inhumane acts committed in the context of an institutionalized regime of systematic oppression and domination, and committed with the intent of maintaining that regime. So what does this institutionalized regime mean? And what does systemic oppression mean? Well, this was really added to the Rome Statute at the insistence of the United States. And they were trying to raise the bar on how we look at organized perpetrators. But do we think that the Taliban, for example, would qualify as this? Absolutely. I totally think they would. In fact, we were showing that and when the ICC trial chamber confirmed charges on their face against the Taliban for gender persecution. And what they said was that gender persecution not only amounts to direct acts of violence, but it's also a systematic and institutionalized form of harm. Now, that's a good thing because that helps us build the case for gender apartheid for once, and when it's codified as a crime. That's really important. And I'm pointing this out because sometimes I hear that, gender persecution can't amount to an institutionalized form of harm. Yes, it can. And then I also hear, well, if we have gender persecution as a charge, why do we need to codify gender apartheid as a crime? And I have to tell you, I find that to be sexist because it's this idea that women victims only get one charge. Well, they already have gender persecution. We don't need to codify gender apartheid. And that's wrong. In international criminal law, we like cumulative charging. In fact, I thought we already won this debate when we codified rape as a form of torture, but apparently it still keeps coming back up. We like cumulative charging, and that's different than complementary charging. Cumulative charging is when we use crimes like gender persecution to build the foundation for larger crimes, like the crime of apartheid or even the crime of genocide. So in this way, persecution complements and it works with apartheid and genocide so that we can capture more inhumane acts and so that we can build a stronger case. And fortunately, we also have Richard Bennett, the UN Special Rapporteur in Afghanistan. He's also echoed this. And why is all this important? Why do we need to codify gender apartheid? Because we are working towards the creep of normalizing perpetrators as authorities of countries. It's a trend that sometimes the international community does. Richard Bennett himself has warned against this. We can't normalize de facto authorities like the Taliban, but sometimes inertia takes us there. And the more we can call out and accurately contextualize and recognize the crimes that perpetrators commit, the more we can push against this trend. So let's deal with the last one. By one racial group over any other racial group or groups. This is the one that I usually spend the most time on. If we want to understand it, we have to look at how groups are understood under international criminal law. So where do we see protected groups under international criminal law? Well, before we look at that, let me just say really quick that to understand treaty interpretation under criminal law, we're looking at the statutory language, right? What does the statute say? What do courts say when they interpret that statute? And what did the drafters mean when they were interpreting that statute? And for criminal law, we also look at strict construction. Like we look at terms pretty narrowly, because we're dealing with defendants' rights, and that's something we respect. So where can we find protected groups under international criminal law? Well, it's not surprising. We find them under the three big discrimination crimes: persecution, apartheid, and genocide. Genocide covers 4 groups: racial, ethnic, national, and religious. Apartheid only covers 1, and persecution covers any group. So we're going to come back to that in a second. So what happens with the crime of genocide? Let's look at how they interpret groups. Well, when we look at courts really struggle with this, because the drafters of the Genocide Convention, which is really where we get our understanding of genocide, that was back in the 1940s. And how did we understand race then, or gender then, or national or ethnic groups then? Not very well. So for racial groups, the way we understood them was that victims were members of racial groups based on biology, based on heredity. And this is what's called objective criteria. And of course, that's been debunked. We don't believe that anymore. We know that race is a social construct, much like gender is a social construct. But courts are beholden, remember, to what the statute says and to what drafters' intent is. So they've grappled with this. And while they've allowed some subjective criteria, which is great, that's how the perpetrator understands a victim, right? Like, that's what we want to use, is who the perpetrator intended to target. They also require some of this objective criteria, a little bit of this like biology or heredity or something that grounds a victim to a group. And that we don't like. Now, if we look at the Apartheid Convention, the Apartheid Convention only has one group, racial groups, and it doesn't have any jurisprudence under international criminal law. But what we do know is that Apartheid Convention takes the understanding of racial groups from the Genocide Convention, and that the drafters understood racial groups the same way that the drafters of the Genocide Convention understood it. And that definition, that term, was then brought into the Rome Statute as well. Now, under the Rome Statute, we have ways to interpret the law under Article 21, which in the statute allows us to look at human rights law. We don't have Article 21 in Crimes Against Humanity Treaty, so that's a problem because we can't use international human rights law to understand these terms. So we've really got to make sure that we're going to get these terms right. So what's going to happen if we adopt this definition of apartheid that's currently in the International Crimes Against Humanity Treaty, and then we adopt the same definition for gender apartheid? Well, one is it's going to further entrench the invisibility of Palestinians who have faced challenges to getting redress and recognition as apartheid victims for these very same reasons. And of course, for gender apartheid to use the same definition, it's going to face challenges with being defined as a biology, which would be a binary, which would mean putting people in categories as men and women, and that risks excluding trans person and the larger, more experiences of LGBTQI plus persons. It also is going to reinforce patriarchy and misogyny, because that's where binary understanding of gender comes from. The other problem with the definition is that it would it also has a problem where if we don't think about how we're going to look at race and gender oppression together, we could end up erasing intersectionality. Now, this has been a very big issue because for Black South African and Namibian women, they have been calling for recognition of gender and racial oppression in South Africa, but they have received very little recognition for the gender oppression conditions that they were forced to live under in South Africa and in Namibia. And that has been a struggle for many Black South African feminists who have looked to gain recognition for those conditions. So while South African advocates have expressed strong solidarity with Afghan women who are resisting Taliban oppression, they're a little worried about adding gender apartheid as a distinct crime in the Crimes Against Humanity Treaty without acknowledging the gendered impacts that happened in South Africa, because that could sideline an unresolved legacy. Now, we have some solutions, but this is one of the big concerns we need to deal with. So what do we know? Well, we know that racial group under genocide and apartheid risks excluding Palestinians and LGBTQI plus people because of this outdated understanding of groups. But we also know we don't have this problem under persecution, because persecution can be against any identifiable group. So what's going on there? Well, if you look at persecution, what you realize is that it's not based on defining a particular group. Persecution doesn't say it has to be against a political group or a racial group. What it says, it has to be based on 7+ grounds. That is talking about perpetrator intent. So persecution only looks at perpetrator intent to understand who the victim is. And that's a more of a modern way of how we understand race and gender. It reflects race, it reflects the social construct understanding of race and gender that we see under international human rights law. So if we look at the Crimes Against Humanity Treaty, it actually uses the same definition as the Rome Statute, and it contains that same problematic language of racial group or groups. What else is missing? What else is a problem with this definition in the Crimes Against Humanity Treaty? It doesn't acknowledge gender oppression or gender domination. So that's missing from this definition as well. So we've got to do some work on modernizing this definition under the treaty. Now, if we look at one of the recommendations that first came out, it makes sense. It starts with defining gender apartheid the same way that racial apartheid is defined. It just exchanges the word race for gender. But what's the problem with this? That would continue the problem of the risk of exclusion, right? Because then we're back to that risk of understanding gender as a binary or as a biology. And it risks further exclusion of Palestinians and other victims, like Iranian victims. And it risks excluding an intersectional approach to oppression. We have to be able to recognize the experience of Black, South African, and Namibian women and LGBTQI plus victims who lived under racial and gender apartheid conditions. They need to be included in this movement too. So, what's a better way to go? Well, in 2024, the UN Working Group on Discrimination Against Women and Girls also made a suggestion for a definition of gender apartheid. And instead of using the old language, they revised the language to say based on gender. What does that look like? That looks like the definition of persecution. That means we could look just at perpetrator intent. We don't have to use this outdated understanding of race or gender. We don't have to use criteria based in biology or hereditary conditions. We can look at it from a contemporary perspective. This definition would be inclusive of women and LGBTQI plus persons and Black, South African, and Namibian women. So if we use the definition from the UN Working Group on Discrimination Against Women and Girls, and we put it into the Crimes Against Humanity Treaty under the definition that's currently there, we have based on race or gender. Now, another way you can say this is on race or gender grounds, means the same thing. But what does that do? That gives us that intersectionality approach that we need. Now we could recognize, with this definition, we could recognize apartheid or that systematic discrimination and oppression based on race or based on gender or based on both. So this definition gives us the most inclusivity in terms of victims. So what is it that we want to do? Well, some of the things we want to do is, one is we want to call for an inclusion of apartheid based on race and gender. We want to be able to recognize victims in Iran, recognize victims in Afghanistan, recognize victims in South Africa in terms of the historical record of what they experienced. And we want to use the definition proposed by the Working Group on Discrimination Against Women and Girls. But that's not all we want. We also need to make sure that states are including civil society in this approach to the treaty. We need South African, Namibian, Afghan, Iranian, Palestinian voices. We need that in the drafting process to make sure that nobody is left out. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Lisa. I'm now very pleased to introduce the next panelist, Moni Rani Das, founder and General Secretary of the Dalit Women Forum and a prominent figure in the Dalit rights movement in Bangladesh. Born and raised in a cleaners colony in Dhaka, Moni Rani's personal experiences motivated her to challenge traditional norms and begin her journey in activism. In 2002, she joined the Bangladesh Dalit Human Rights Organization as the Secretary of Women's Affairs. Driven by a strong desire to improve the lives of Dalit women and girls, Moni Rani continued to work passionately for their rights and development. In pursuit of this goal, she founded her own organization in 2006, the Dalit Women Forum, with the aim of empowering Dalit women through collective action. She has received numerous rewards for her work, including most recently the 2025 Kamla Bhasin Award for driving gender equality across South Asia. In August 2018, Moni Rani became the first Dalit person to be part of the National Human Rights Commission of Bangladesh. Moni Rani joins us today. However, due to recent health concerns, Amma Famida Sultana, supervisor at the Dalit Women's Forum, will be presenting on her behalf. Famida's work at DWF includes supervising field operations, organizing community events, and assisting marginalized women through advocacy and empowerment initiatives. She has experience with capacity building, stakeholder coordination, project implementation, and monitoring. The presentation is entitled Caste, Patriarchy, and Resistance, Unpacking Gender Apartheid in Bangladesh. Famida, over to you.
Thank you, Melissa. Good evening, good morning, and good afternoon. I am very glad to be a part in this webinar. First, I just share my here is my presentation. My title is Caste, Patriarchy and Resistance, Unpacking Gender Apartheid in Bangladesh. Actually, we are here talking about Dalits. So it is our, I'm sorry, actually, I have to say something about who are Dalits. In Bangladesh, we have many diverse communities, including Muslims, Hindu, Christian, and Buddhist. Among these groups, Dalit is a distinct marginalized community, identified not only by their religion, but also by their ethnicity, occupation-based caste identity, and in some cases, their own culture and linguistic traits. In Bangladesh, we have two types Dalit. One is migrant Dalit and the other one is by-born Dalit. Migrant Dalit, they are by-born Dalit, they have some land, their own land. But the migrant Dalit, they don't have their own land. They lived in some selected apartments or buildings by the government with some legal facilities. In these pictures, you see our Dalit community people. There are some women here. And here in another picture, you see a Dalit colony. In this colony, they have 8 feet to 10 feet room, and each room they live joint family by generation by generation. Origins of Dalit. The ancestors of many of the current population of Dalits are brought to Bangladesh mainly from the current Indian states of Bihar, Uttar Pradesh, Andhra Pradesh, and Madhya Pradesh by the British colonial administration during the first half of the 19th century. Mainly in Bangladesh, Dalits, in this picture, you see of Dalit. Here, a woman is sitting. This is a rural picture, and you see a cradle here, which made by cloth, and they use it for their baby. Population of Dalit. There is disagreement about the size of Dalit population in Bangladesh. Some sources estimate a population of 500,000 Dalit, while others estimate the number of range between 3.5 to 4.5 million to even 1% of the total population in Bangladesh. Actually, there are approximately 160 million people in Bangladesh, and our social welfare department survey claimed that the number of Dalit in our country is about 65 lakh, which is 6.5 million. That means in total population, 1% Dalit in Bangladesh. This is a Dalit colony. Here you see they are living in a slum area in Dhaka city. Now, Dalits in Bangladesh. Many Dalits are landless and lived in segregated colonies or slum areas or public land, which called in Bangla Khash Bhumi, and where they face lack of proper water and sanitation facilities. Even they don't have the right to get government job because they don't have their permanent address or their own land. Dalits in Bangladesh, they are live mainly in rural areas, and pre-urban areas. They don't have their own land. In this case, we have Dalit in our tea garden areas, and one inhabitant of tea garden area who is selected for a government job, but he can't take the job because of her land right. And then our former chairperson, Dr. Mizanur Rahman of Human Rights Commission, she advocated this issue with the police department, and then one of the member of police department gave a land to the boy, and then she got the job. Actually, this is the main problem in Dalit in Bangladesh. Then here we see two pictures. This is a slum area, and where Dalit lives. This is a drainage system. Beside this system, Dalit community live in here, and over the drainage system, they built their tent. You can see the pictures where there is. Uh, Here is their house, and the another picture is sometimes they because this is a drain, so sometimes they are cause flood and water logging. In this picture you see the baby of Dalit community, they are playing with the waterlogged unsafe water. This is very crucial picture in our Dalit community in Bangladesh. Caste in Bangladesh. At present, there are many castes belongs in Bangladesh. They are Dom, who are cremating dead bodies and other ritual duties. Cobbler, garland maker, potter, honey collector, shoemaker, fisherman, sweeper, tea laborer, etc. Here you see two pictures. One is a shoemaker or cobbler, and another one is scavenger or sweeper. In Bangladesh, manual scavenging is still existing, and here we see this man is scavenging without any PPE, personal protective equipment. So that's why they are always facing skin disease problems and other diseases. This is another crucial fact in Bangladesh. Panchayat system in Bangladesh. Panchayat system plays a significant role in community governments, particularly within Dalit communities where access to formal justice is limited. And the main problem is patriarchy. Patriarchy at its core is a system of male dominance. In this panchayat system, here in this picture, you see there is no female members. In panchayat system, all the members are male, and they are justice. So they are doing the social justice. Where female members are not allowed to speak, or they are not allowed to come. So Panchayat plays a significant role in our Dalit community in Bangladesh. Dalit women, gender apartheid. Dalit women are especially vulnerable. They face discrimination within their own community as women and from dominant other communities as a Dalit woman. Lack of education, economic hardship, poverty, social stigma, and early marriage is the main reason for their vulnerability. For this reason, DWF, Dalit Women Forum, organized awareness meeting in Dalit colony to make them aware about their rights, women education, effects of early marriage, sexual reproductive health, and gender discrimination. They believe women are not to educate enough. So what will they do in future? They have actually, this is the male thinking. Actually, main thing the male members are think that women are not to do anything. They have no right to do anything, and they are always doing busy with their household activities. So education, lack of education is a main problem in Dalit community, and Dalit young girls who don't have to school after complete their primary education. In this system, Dalit women organization awareness meeting in Dalit colonies. Here we see all the members are female, and the Dalit women aware them about their rights, their education, early marriage, effect of early marriage, and sexual reproductive health. Here you see a awareness meeting session conducted by Dalit Women Forum. Result of survey. Here is the result of survey. One result is conducted by Nagorik Udyog. The Nagorik Udyog is a prominent organization in Bangladesh where they interviewed 500 Dalit women and girls regarding the education, health, profession, child matter, etc. The result is, among them, 6.1% had completed the primary education, 5.9% completed the secondary education, and none of the respondents had completed the HEC level. 47% women who work at home and are not involved in any economic activities. The general health awareness of respondents were satisfying. They know about the health facilities provided by the government or other private organization. 38.6% of Dalit girls are married of between the age of 16 to 18 and become the victim of child marriage. Actually, this is the picture. This is the real picture of Dalit women in our country. Here we see the role of Dalit women. Dalit Women Forum is a Bangladesh-based women-led organization dedicated to advocating the rights, dignity, and empowerment of Dalit women. Dalit Women Forum operates in 48 Dalit colonies across Dhaka, Keranganj, and Narayanganj districts. Here in this picture, we see our General Secretary Moni Rani Das is attend with the FGS team. FGS, our donor agency for Foundation for Just Society. Here is the picture. Child marriage. Here is the success story of Dalit Women Forum. In this picture, we see a girl. This is the girl. Her name is Mala Rani. She was a victim of child marriage. At the age of 15, her parents tried to not her tie with somebody, but at the age of 15, when Moni Rani aware about this news, he went to her family and took all the responsibilities of this girl. And at the age now, she is at 25 years old, and she serves as a community mobilizer for Dalit Women Forum. Now she is still unmarried. DWF works. Dalit Women Forum perform a lot of activities about a lot of activities for the welfare of Dalit women and girls. In these, among these activities, we are Women Day, International Women Day observing is one of them. Dalit Women Forum celebrating International Women's Day to make them aware about their social, economical, political, and cultural rights. Also we are observing Orange Day, the day of eradication of all forms of rights against violence against women and girls. We are observing International Girl Child Day also. We involved. Dalit Women Forum participated in a protest to end all forms of violence and discrimination against women. Here is a picture where we see our General Secretary Moni Rani Das is attending in this protest. We organized a capacity building training for Dalit women to increase leadership skill in them. We conduct capacity building training on gender issues, because gender issue is a very crucial issue in Bangladesh. Dalit women face this issue very crucially. So we make them aware about these issues. Thank you everybody for my presentation. That's my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Famida. And Moni, I think you're online too, so thank you both. So now it's time for the Q&A part of the webinar. We've started receiving some questions. Okay, great. So there are around 4 or 5 questions. What I'll do is I'll just read them out, and then the panelists can also perhaps choose which ones they would like to answer. The first one is, what is the difference between gender apartheid and gender persecution? And Lisa, you touched upon this, but I think people have had a lot of information, so it might be great if you could clarify it one more time. That's the first question that we received. The other question is with regards to Afghanistan. It is, if the international community does not recognize the Taliban as an official government, how can it facilitate change in Afghanistan? What authority does the ICC actually have in Afghanistan as it is now? The other question that we have received, I think, relates more to the situation in Bangladesh, which is, has anyone escaped Dalit life? Another question for the panelists, and this is specific to Iran, so maybe Bahar, you would like to take this one. How can individuals become involved in the campaign to end gender apartheid? Is there anything that maybe those from among the audience today can do to support the campaign, and also to elevate a greater understanding of the situation in Iran? So those are 4 questions. Perhaps we can start with those and tackle any additional questions that we receive after that. So I don't know, Lisa, perhaps you'd like to go first, since this first question is on the distinction between gender apartheid and gender persecution, and then the others can follow.
Sure, I'm happy to. It's a great question. Oftentimes we see crimes that overlap, but they also differentiate. So for example, under the Rome Statute, just to give people an idea of crimes they might be more familiar with, we have murder as a crime. We also have extermination as a crime, right? A crime against humanity. So what does that mean? That's bigger than murder. It means killing a bunch of people. And then we have genocide as a crime. So what does that mean? That also means killing a bunch of people. But genocide captures something different. It captures the intent to destroy a group in whole or in part. So it's capturing a discrimination, right, behind that killing of a mass group of people. And it's also capturing who you're targeting in that mass group of people. So all three of these crimes are very similar. Sometimes you can charge them cumulatively. Sometimes you can't. They're too similar. And it's why we look at crimes and try to understand the difference. So what's the difference between persecution and apartheid? Well, if you look at the definitions of persecution and apartheid, what you see is that apartheid is capturing that institutionalized regime. So that structure of systematic oppression and domination that's happening within a particular society or region or under a particular perpetrator's control. And when you look at gender persecution, persecution is encompassing direct acts of violence. So those acts of violence can also be systemic and institutionalized forms of harm, but it's not capturing that there was an institutionalized regime conducting them. But do you see how they relate and they interplay together? So what's good about this is that gender persecution isn't just random acts, right? They can be coordinated acts or acts that are a pattern, that are a part of a systematic pattern. Those acts added together, if you go to the next step, could amount to an organized regime that has a plan and a way that they're implementing those systemized acts. So they build together. So if you can charge persecution, right, then you're bringing those acts into charging a larger structure of apartheid. And it kind of works the same with genocide. If you start to charge persecution for recognized protected groups under genocide, it also builds your case for genocide. And you can do the same thing there. So what they all have in common, apartheid, genocide, and persecution, of course, is that they're the big discriminatory crimes. They're not the only crimes that hold discrimination accountable. I want to be clear on that. But they're the big ones that really explicitly hold that intent to discriminate from a perpetrator of why he's committing those heinous acts accountable. So I hope that helps.
No, that's very helpful. Thank you, Lisa. Would you also quickly like to take the question on Afghanistan regarding, let me see, to go back and read it. If the international community does not recognize the Taliban as an official government, how can it facilitate change? More specifically, what authority does the ICC actually have in Afghanistan right now? If you could just briefly answer that in a minute, that would be great.
Sure. Well, I don't think we want to recognize the Taliban as an official government because they're perpetrators, and the International Criminal Court holds individual perpetrators accountable of crimes. So it's already issued two arrest warrants for two members of the Taliban regime and has asked for them to be held accountable. And what this does is it sends a chilling effect to the international community to say, you can't treat them as the rightful government because they're not. That if they do come into your country and you are a signatory to the Rome Statute, that you have to arrest them and that you have to turn them over to the court. And it tells the world that what's happened to Afghan women and girls and LGBTQI plus persons, that they are victims of what the Taliban is doing and that they need to be held accountable. So to me, the only way forward is to push for that accountability and to push for states to uphold that accountability and to ensure that we're recognizing what happens to victims and not moving towards this normalization of, well, they're just the government now, because that would give them certain rights and access to the UN and to other spaces that perpetrators of armed actors should not have.
Indeed. Thank you so much, Lisa. I think that's really helpful. So now the questions are really pouring in. So what I'm going to do is combine the question that I think is, with regard to Bangladesh with another one and just ask you, Famida, if you can respond to the question as to whether anyone has escaped Dalit life and what's the relationship between the Bangladeshi Dalit community and other South Asian Dalits in other South Asian countries. If you could very briefly in 1 or 2 minutes respond to that question, please. Thank you.
Okay. Most of the Dalits in Bangladesh are Hindu, and there are also Christian Dalits who converted during the colonial period. They are socially excluded, stigmatized, and isolated from mainstream society. Actually, they love to live in their own group. So no one is escaped from no one is escaped from the Dalit community. They love to live with their own culture. They love to live with their own people. They are divided by small groups. Each caste has their own groups, the relation of each group is very strong. In the mainstream society, Dalit people are not allowed to live with them. They are isolated from the mainstream society. So they are very so the Dalit community people have a very good bonding with them.
Thank you so much, Famida.
Thank you, Melissa.
So the other question was in relation to Iran. Bahar, in case you'd like to just briefly state how individuals can support the campaign and elevate, awareness of the situation in Iran or respond to what's happening there.
Of course. In terms of the campaign, you can visit the endgenderapartheid.today, and it will give you a lot of resources that you can use to take action. What we're doing is pushing both for domestic law and international law to recognize gender apartheid. So within your own countries, you can push for domestic change as well, and also encourage states to support codification on the international stage, and also just recognize the existence of gender apartheid in Iran and Afghanistan and other countries as well. And how to keep up with Iran, follow civil society's work. The Center for Human Rights, for example, is one of many. We post a lot of news coming out of Iran that often don't get international attention. So local news that's translated in English and easy to keep up with. A lot of people think the situation in Iran is okay now because the Women Life Freedom Revolution is quieted, but it's not actually true. Repression is extremely high right now, despite the news and the videos that we might see of women walking around without hijab. That's just the surface. When you go deeper, you'll see that political prisoners are still being arrested, executions are at all times high, and torture and discrimination for minorities are still ongoing. Baha'is, Jews and Christians are still being arrested. So the repression is at all times high, and I hope people keep up with the news. And when we shed lights on these issues, it helps the people inside the country a lot.
Thank you so much, Bahar. So yeah, we're getting a lot of questions now. So I'm just gonna have to be selective here, and I apologize in advance to anyone whose question does not get fielded. But one question is, what mechanisms currently exist to hold the ruling bodies, governments, entities accountable for gender apartheid as a crime against humanity? So are there any mechanisms that currently exist that can actually do this? I think the answer to this might be very brief, but because I don't know, Lisa, would you like to just...
Want me to just give a brief answer?
Yeah.
Not yet. That would be the answer.
Yes.
But I mean, right now, because gender apartheid, we don't have an agreed upon definition. We don't have enough consensus on it being recognized as a crime. We're moving towards there, but we need those things. Right now, it just is more of a term of art, like gender-based violence isn't a crime that you can charge. So it's more of a term of art, but if we could get consensus on these things and move it towards codification, say in the Crimes Against Humanity Treaty, then we can start moving towards universal jurisdiction and national legislation and figuring out ways to bring it into the ICC. But that's the first step that has to happen. And that's why codification in the treaty is so important.
So I have a follow-up question to that, Lisa, actually. Then how do you view the case that has been brought in the International Court of Justice under CEDAW? I know it's not very specifically and solely on gender apartheid per se, because as you say, it hasn't been defined. Although the CEDAW committee has also recently issued a statement in support of its legal recognition. So do you think that will provide any kind of remedy or lead to some kind of progression of this whole effort?
Yeah, I think every little bit helps.
Mm.
There's a difference between gender apartheid as a human rights violation and
Mm.
gender apartheid as a crime.
Yeah.
So those would be codified in different treaties, right? Like a human rights treaty could codify gender apartheid as a human rights violation by writing a comment or bringing it into the understanding of its treaty.
Mm.
We have a lower bar for how we hold human rights violations accountable, and the human rights system is more about holding states accountable, whereas we have a higher bar for criminal law because it's about individuals, and because we want to respect defendants' rights because the punishments come with jail and much more heavier tolls. So we're more careful, and usually these are different tracks of law, so they don't always intermingle unless you have like an explicit provision in your treaty that allows it, which we have in the Rome Statute, but we don't have the Crimes Against Humanity Treaty. So it's just a question of, getting it recognized everywhere we can, and the International Court of Justice would certainly be a big help if they were willing to do that.
Thank you. That's really helpful to, I think, understand how all these different efforts are sort of interacting with each other and what we might be able to expect and how people might also become involved and participate. So there's another question I'm going to combine two, and I think this is going to also come to you, Lisa, because there's something you said earlier about towards the end of your presentation about how now it's really important for those who are experiencing what we view as gender apartheid in different countries to be able to come together and for their voices and perspectives to be brought to bear on this process that is underway. So, how can that happen? Is there anyone or any organization that's coordinating that? Is that already happening? Is it just a question of people joining an ongoing effort? Or is that something that is still an aspiration and that needs to happen? And then someone related to this has specifically asked about, and referring to, I think, just maybe your presentation saying you mentioned how Palestinians are not included in the current definition and frameworks, but can you talk a bit about who's preventing this? Like, why are they excluded?
Okay, let me take the first one, the last one first. So I would say, I'm always careful with my language, and I say that there's a risk of exclusion because I always argue no matter what language you have, you can't exclude victims and they need to be recognized. That's not necessarily what courts do or what accountability mechanisms have done. And certainly these archaic interpretations of like racial group have been challenges in terms of recognizing what is clearly an apartheid system that Palestinians have experienced. So that doesn't mean that we don't recognize it as a human rights violation, but we need to also recognize it as a crime of apartheid. And the reason for Palestinians is because, we have a great UN report that came out that recognizes genocide that happened in Palestine. But if we're looking at something like reparations, it would be easy to just say that we're going to look to victims since October 2023, to say that that's when the attack began, that's when the genocide began. And then what's going to happen to all the victims Palestinian victims since before October 2023? And if you try to use individual crimes to bring them in, it's a lot harder. But if you have an umbrella crime, like a systematic crime, like apartheid, which clearly exists, then you can bring in thousands more victims from years of oppression. And we owe that to Palestinians to recognize them. So there are real stakes at what we recognize. And that doesn't matter if the Crimes Against Humanity Treaty passes or doesn't it's not, because reparations are retroactive. We can go back in time and look at who victims are. And we've done that before. We did that in World War II. So it's really, really high stakes in terms of how we understand these crimes. And just in terms of the first question of like, can we do this? Can we bring everyone together? Yes, that is movement building. I mean, you have one of the authors of movement building here on this call, Charlotte Bunch. If anybody knows how to do movement building, it's Charlotte, and she's done it before we even had technology and cell phones and internet. So yes, we can. We have great examples from our women's movement of examples of creating UN Women, of getting gender crimes recognized and enumerated in the Rome Statute. We've done it before, and we can do it again. And we need to bring together Palestinians, Afghans, South Africans, Bangladeshians, Iranians, and movement build and get on the same page and make sure that we have our criminal law experts there. So we're using language that includes everyone. But the advantage to including everyone is that then you have everyone fighting for the same thing. So sometimes I think we get scared about changing language in treaties because it's just easier to adopt old language because we'll have consensus and we'll get states on board. And, we have to pay attention to some of that in negotiations, but we never want to give up our principles. We never want to make sure anybody is being excluded, especially people who are at the forefront who are fighting for this. So that includes Afghanistans and South Africans and Palestinians and others. So let's get them together. Let's talk, let's work this out, and let's form a movement around the right language, and let's get this done. We've done it before. We can do it again.
Exactly. This is good. There's good history that needs to repeat itself here, be repeated. So thank you so much. I think just as the discussion was getting really exciting, unfortunately, we do have to start wrapping up. But what I'm going to do is just give our panelists about a minute each to share any final reflection, comment, thought that you have, if there's anything else. And there's one really interesting question here, which I'm going to throw out in case you'd like to respond to this question in your final reflection, and that is, why does so much advocacy remain UN-centric? What is the role of regional bodies, other entities at different levels? In case anyone would like to comment on that aspect. I think it's a really good question, but unfortunately we're out of time. But if one of you can respond to that within your reflection, that would be great. So I can start with Famida to give Lisa a moment to breathe, and then Bahar, and then we'll come back to Lisa. And Charlotte, if you're on the call, please go ahead. It can be a call to action also, anything you'd like to.
Sure. I think one thing I didn't really talk about during my presentation is that when it comes to Iran specifically, a lot of the stuff I talked about is often talked about as a cultural issue in Iran. It's very disregarded, and people don't really like to apply the term gender apartheid to Iran. And they don't know how to talk about the issues in Iran. When they want to talk about hijab laws, they say, okay, we don't want to be Islamophobic. We don't want to, for example, say the wrong thing. And I think one thing that the gender apartheid campaign is really making clear and making it easy for people is naming the crime and naming what is happening in Iran. So people are not scared to no longer scared to talk about what is happening in Iran. And I think that's across the board for all the countries that face this issue.
Thank you so much, Bahar. Charlotte, is there anything you'd like to share?
Well, I think the question that someone raised about UN-centric is a really good question. And part of the problem is that we don't often talk in these global conversations about the regional initiatives that have been really important. So just in terms of violence against women, it was the Latin American region that first passed a convention on violence against women. And maybe 20 years later, the European region adopted the Istanbul Protocol on violence against women. And we, I think on the international level, many of us decided to kind of move that issue into the CEDAW Convention. But we certainly want to recognize, and maybe we need to talk about more, how it is often at the regional level that some of these issues start. And I think you really put the question very well. When we're having global conversations, let's also talk about how these issues get moved at the regional level. One example to bring us back to the 16 days that I meant to mention before. Yeah. Some of you may know the name Eva Joyce Nguyen from Zimbabwe. She really started the 16 days of activism throughout Africa after leaving our Leadership Institute. working through Women in Law and Development Africa. And that's really how the campaign became so popular in the entire African region. So, yes, I think we need to utilize and think about the regional mechanisms. And we also need to talk globally about how it is often easier to start something at the regional level and then to adapt and move it to the global. So thank you for that. And thank you for this wonderful conversation, because I'm so thrilled that this issue, which I've also been following and trying to understand about gender apartheid, has such a great airing as a launch of this year's 16 days. So thank you, Melissa. Thank you, Lisa. Thank you, all of you. Julie, of course.
Thank you, Charlotte. Yes, and I would like to echo Charlotte's thoughts. I think this is an amazing start to this year's campaign, very timely, much needed. There is a great urgency here. And Lisa, I just want to ask you, is there anything else you'd like to add before I hand the floor back to Julie? Just as a final thought.
Sure. I think what I would add is that that we always need to be thinking about intersectionality, that the opposite of intersectionality is essentialism. And that movements start regionally and they grow and they help us through movement building to raise issues that and show the universality in what we experience. So when we look at femicides in Latin America, or honor killings in Iraq, or the abuse of domestic workers in the US, or corrective rape in South Africa, that these started with regional movements to recognize them as crimes. And what we don't want to do is essentialize them to those regions, because they are universal in the way that they work. This is all about oppression of women and gender. And we have to recognize that. And it's the same thing, I think, with gender apartheid. We start with this recognition and this movement building in Afghanistan. And we have to recognize Iran and South Africa and Bangladesh. And we have to make sure it's not essentialized to one context, but that it's universally applied so that we understand it as a universal crime, because that's part of challenging the patriarchy and fighting sexism as well, is to say that women's rights are human rights and universal rights. And where we experience issues or crimes is not otherizing. That just happens over there. It happens everywhere. It might look different, but it's the same discrimination that drives it.
Correct. So the struggle continues, but I believe we are on the right side of history. So with that, we've arrived at the end of the Q&A part of the webinar. We went over time a bit. I do apologize to the organizers, but I hope everyone found the discussion to be very informative. And now I hope many of you feel very motivated to follow up and to continue to, sort of see what happens with these advocacy initiatives and the movement as a whole. So thank you everyone for your interest, for your participation. A special thanks to the panelists, of course, the organizers and the audience for staying on for some extra time. Thank you, Julie, as well. I'm going to hand the floor over to you now for the closing.
Thank you, Melissa. So please join me, everyone, in thanking Charlotte, Melissa, Bahar, Lisa, and Moni Rani and Famida for a dynamic and highly informative session. Thank you all. It was wonderful. So much great information. I also want to thank our team members, Nishi Shah and Akanksha Bhatter, for their amazing work on this event. A big thank you to our sponsors from the Rutgers New Brunswick campus, whose support really made the panel possible. And of course, but never least, we thank you, our audience, for taking the time out of your busy schedules to join us and for staying late with us. Thank you all again for joining us. Thank you very much.